Good morning, everyone. We're going to wait just a couple of minutes for everyone to come in before we get started. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us on the second day of the 2022 annual meeting of the United States Committee of the Blue Shield, also known as USCBS. My name is Brian Daniels, and I am the organization's vice president. The USCBS is dedicated to the prevention of the destruction and theft of cultural property during times of armed conflict. It was formed following the Second Gulf War in 2006, with the aim of encouraging the United States and its armed forces to be in greater compliance with international humanitarian law, protecting global cultural heritage. The name, the Blue Shield, comes from the 1954 Hague Convention for the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict, which specifies a blue shield as the symbol for marking protected cultural property. Blue Shield International and its affiliated national committees work together as the cultural equivalent of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, providing an emergency response to cultural property at risk in war. In practice, this means that the United States Committee of the Blue Shield is especially concerned with cultural genocide. That is the deliberate erasure of a people through the destruction of their culture and heritage. When I think about my work with this organization and why I encourage others to be involved, I think back to Raphael Lemkin, the Polish jurist who coined the word genocide and advocated for the adoption of the 1949 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Lemkin famously wrote that there are three irreplaceable casualties of war: human lives, works of art, and written records. There are many organizations that deal with human lives in war, but very few indeed that deal with works of art and written records in times of conflict. The USCBS and its sibling national committees of the Blue Shield are among the few. Looking back on the 1949 Genocide Convention, Lemkin lamented that the treaty only included the loss of life as a crime and not the erasure of a people through the destruction of their creative works and their history. For Lemkin, these were inseparable to the crime of genocide, and it was the settler states, the United States, Canada, Australia, and others that objected to the inclusion of culture in the Genocide Convention out of their concern for their complicity in the genocide of Indigenous peoples. I come to you today virtually from the traditional ancestral homelands of the Piscataway and Anacostans and the neighboring Pamunkey peoples. The District of Columbia is surrounded by just over a dozen tribal nations that have long thrived along the Anacostia and Potomac River watersheds, Chesapeake Bay area, and the states of Maryland, Virginia, and Delaware. It is the history of these tribal nations and others in the United States that reminds me of the urgency, not only to do the work of cultural repair together with these communities, but to address the ongoing erasure of culture and peoples here and abroad right now. Today, we are especially mindful of the events in Ukraine, as Russian battlefield tactics indiscriminately target cultural heritage sites and civilian infrastructure, much as they have done in the Syrian war since 2015. The visuals we see on social media are jarring and unsettling. Our professional community often describes the preservation of cultural heritage as a neutral activity, as part of shared global concern, and the province of civilian actors and expert specialists. However, this optimistic approach favors expert considerations over strategic uses. This is not the case for other international actors. For example, it is now clear that many countries, especially the BRICS, have used the UNESCO World Heritage Committee as a mechanism to advance national economic interests. But it is also the case that countries have employed strategic disinformation campaigns and restoration projects as a tactic for advancing irredentist claims to land. The use of cultural heritage to visually reterritorialize old borders through an architectural vocabulary, or even to resurrect the specter of empire through the construction of new old monuments, is now a regular feature of gray zone competition. Strategic achievements resulting from this tactic are little understood at a moment when great clarity is needed. Indeed, our professional colleagues in Ukraine and Georgia have been warning of malign Russian influence in the cultural heritage sector for over a decade. Their words now seem prophetic. Our panelists today will explore Russian uses of heritage sites in intelligence operations and in kinetic conflict in Ukraine and Georgia. First, we will hear from Dr. Hayden Bassett, Director of the Cultural Heritage Monitoring Lab and Assistant Curator of Archaeology at the Virginia Museum of Natural History and Research Associate of the Smithsonian Institution. Members of the public will recognize Dr. Bassett for his recent work on active monitoring of damage to Ukrainian cultural heritage sites, which was featured on PBS NewsHour. Our colleagues in uniform may recognize him from recent presentations to Civil Affairs. Dr. Bassett received his doctoral degree and Master of Arts degree in anthropology from the College of William and Mary, and his Bachelor of Arts degree in anthropology from the University of Pennsylvania. He has served as an archaeologist for the United States Department of the Navy and as Associate Curator of Archaeology for the Jamestown Rediscovery Project. Second, we will hear from Mr. Damian Koropeckyj, who is a field archaeologist and senior analyst at the Cultural Heritage Monitoring Laboratory at the Virginia Museum of Natural History. He holds a Master of Arts degree in Greek and Eastern Mediterranean archaeology from the University of Athens and a Bachelor of Arts degree in Global Studies from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. His prior experience includes work with the United States Department of State at the Embassy in Moscow from 2012 to 2014. Finally, we will conclude with Ms. Grace Golden, who is the incoming Senior Officer of Relocation and Resettlement for the Artistic Freedom Initiative. Today is her last day as Program Coordinator for the Penn Cultural Heritage Center at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. On a personal note, as I too am based at the Penn Cultural Heritage Center, I will miss Ms. Golden greatly, as her collaboration, diligence, and good humor have contributed to the success of so many heritage projects that we have worked on together over the past 7 years. But I am very excited for her and her future work at the Artistic Freedom Initiative, which has stood together with the cultural heritage community as a strong partner in supporting the safe resettlement of curators, conservators, and archaeologists whose lives have been threatened. I know that our professional networks will still have the support of Ms. Golden in her new and expanded role. Ms. Golden received her Master of Arts degree from the University of Pennsylvania, where her research focused on religious heritage in the occupied territories of Georgia, and her Bachelor of Arts degree in anthropology and the history of art from Johns Hopkins University, where she was a Bloomberg Scholar. Dr. Bassett, the virtual podium is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Daniels, for that introduction, and thank you everyone for being here today. I am going to now share my presentation. So bear with me for 1 second. All right. Today I'm going to be talking about an active project we have here at the Cultural Heritage Monitoring Lab. In many ways, this kind of sets the stage for some of the other talks that you'll hear today, but also kind of gives you a glimpse into a new set of approaches that we're using to actively monitor a conflict in more or less real time, and cultural heritage impacts in that conflict in real time. So with that, I'll get started with just a brief introduction to who we are. The Cultural Heritage Monitoring Lab is located here in Martinsville, Virginia, that's Southern Virginia, at the Virginia Museum of Natural History. And I'm not going to read this paragraph for you, but I'm going to give you an idea of just a quick summary, is that we provide global modeling and monitoring capability for cultural heritage sites threatened by armed conflict and natural disaster. As you can see on the screen here, that we use a variety of tools to do that, some of which are automated or remote sensing based, analytical based, and others are very manual human processes, which you'll see a little bit of both of today. We benefit from a number of partnerships that allow us to deploy these capabilities and develop some of these new capabilities. And so I would like to just begin by acknowledging that this is not a one-man show by any means, but this is the Cultural Heritage Monitoring Lab is in fact a team. So here is our core team members here. We have Kate Harrell, William Welsh, Damian Koropeckyj, who you'll be hearing from later, and Madeline Gunter Bassett. I would also like to acknowledge that some of the folks, the attendees of this conference that I just saw, are also part of the extended team. Sonia Dixon, Eric DeMarche, a few others, I believe, who are on the line now. So with that, what do we do? So the core tasks of this lab are we focus on monitoring impacts to cultural heritage in armed conflict, monitoring impacts to cultural heritage during and immediately following natural disasters. We develop predictive models for archaeology. For those archaeologists in attendance, you're very familiar with what I'm talking about. Basically, where is human settlement likely to have occurred in a given time, in a given place? This allows us to take kind of a proactive stance in cultural property protection before we even know exactly where those sites are. And then last, vulnerability modeling for archaeology and cultural heritage in conflict and natural disaster. So not just identifying impacts after the fact, but again, trying to get out ahead and determine vulnerabilities prior to a conflict and prior to natural disaster. Now, today's focus in this talk is going to be our ongoing efforts in Ukraine. We use a variety of tools, but for this specific effort, we're largely using imagery and sensor-based monitoring, and you'll see why. Just one example of our satellites. This is a Super Dove satellite that we use on a daily basis. But where does country-wide cultural heritage monitoring begin? I think most people in attendance are very familiar with this process, but I kind of wanted to give you just a brief snapshot of our starting place and maybe how it might be similar to your efforts or might differ from your efforts. But where do we begin by building a countrywide cultural heritage inventory? So I wanted to just quickly say that, here are a few select types that we include, and not just this inventory, but all of the inventories that we develop for countrywide monitoring. So these include a comprehensive picture of archaeological sites, museums, archives, historic buildings, regardless of the contemporary function of those historic buildings. So even if it's, a contemporary, by all means, a restaurant or, government building, the fact that it's a historic building is what we are primarily focused on in this effort. And so we also include churches, cathedrals, chapels, other religious spaces like mosques, temples for Ukraine, cemeteries and graveyards, monuments of varying status and size. So this includes everything from your, private monument in maybe a government compound all the way to a public monument meant for public kind of appreciation and consumption, but also memorials, things that not only are or memorialize something, but also celebrate something. We include shrines. This is kind of a slightly different category. that we have a lot of in Ukraine, cultural centers and art installations. This isn't everything, but I just wanted to give you just a brief snapshot of the spectrum of cultural heritage that we are trying to capture in our cultural heritage inventory building. And I'll just note that the data standards that we use are an impressive data standard provided to us by Penn Museum and Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative. And these are the Chisel data standards, which I think in the coming months, you'll be hearing a lot more about. But I won't focus on that today, but just know that these are data standards that are specifically meant to do these types of works in a systematic and common operating sort of way. So why do we take this approach? This approach is a little bit different from approaches we've taken in the past. And I'll just say that we made it a quick determination that rather than beginning from a prioritization list of cultural heritage, our determinations of, our own determinations of significance, which we are in no way qualified to make for a place like Ukraine, we began from a comprehensive picture across the spectrum of cultural heritage, and that's for a few reasons. So first, this allows some level of control for the biases that are inherent to this process of cultural heritage monitoring using something like, remote sensing, satellite imagery. Those biases stem from researcher background. I am not formally trained in the cultural heritage of Ukraine. So I carry with me, as does everyone, biases in my research training, proficiency in certain cultural heritage types. And so those might filter through when I'm focusing on monitoring just from, a researcher looking at imagery and a list that they have created. We do not make determinations of priority or do not start from determinations of priority just because of how much is missed when we do so. So as I mentioned earlier, determination of significance is something that the host nation is certainly qualified to do, but we are not. Prioritizations, we work with prioritization lists, but those are on the back end of the process rather than the front end of the process. And last in these biases, it allows for a control in the influence that might filter through from things like funding, scopes, and other structures in the research administration of a project. And so at the end of the day, though, I think the greatest advantage of an approach like this, when we include all forms of cultural heritage, it allows for us to view of impacts that would otherwise go unseen for reasons of scale, for reasons, again, of significance, determined significance, and for reasons of, what types of cultural heritage people consider worth monitoring. So we can just sort of remove that question from the beginning. And I'll just say that, here's a snapshot of our current inventory for Ukraine. We have over 26,000 cultural heritage sites in Ukraine that include those site types across that spectrum of cultural heritage. And so again, when you consider, every single church, chapel, mosque, cathedral, archaeological site, monument, museums, archives that one could map in a very finite amount of time, that picture becomes quite large at the country scale. And so that's why we have upwards of 26,000 plus sites currently in our inventory that we are actively monitoring. Now, here's just a close-up view of what that looks like, a little bit closer to the ground. You can see that, a prioritization list, if we were to start from that, might focus on a series of sites that are most likely to be located in that city center, for Kharkiv, an example here. But when we include that spectrum of cultural heritage, you can see that it goes well beyond that city center to the administrative boundaries and well beyond those administrative boundaries of Kharkiv into the more rural areas where we still have very, just in a more objective way, saying very significant cultural heritage that would otherwise go unseen, and more importantly, the impacts to which would otherwise go unseen. So where do we start once we have our 26,000 cultural heritage sites in an inventory? We do what many people do. We do satellite imagery monitoring, but we don't focus just on the optics, the optical imagery itself. You might be asking, how does a small team focus on 26,000 sites every day? And I'll say that, it's not just a very manual process. We do rely on a degree of, or sort of an analytical function that allows us to make or sort of prioritize what we're looking at any given moment based on impacts that can be detected. And so what does that look like? Now, everyone's familiar with, the core satellites that are imaging the Earth on a daily basis. But there are far more than that. Here's just a quick Google Earth view. I actually didn't realize you could do this in Google Earth, but you can go on Google Earth and you can see all of the active satellites in orbit right now. Now, this is a picture of the active satellites in orbit. There's far more satellites that are inactive or on standby in orbit right now. But those satellites are capturing everything from, Earth observation, kind of atmospheric data, to the optical information, the imagery that you use in Google Maps, Google Earth, and in your monitoring efforts every day. But also a variety of sensors on board those satellites that actually help in these processes more than maybe has been traditionally relied upon in the past. So how do we utilize all of that technology in orbit right now in order to help identify impacts at the scale of a country during an active conflict? And more importantly, how do we keep up with the tempo of the conflict itself? And so here's kind of our beginning place for that process. We utilize sensors on board those satellites in order to determine when and where kinetic activity in a conflict has occurred in the past 24 to 48 hours. And so what you're looking at on the screen right now, there's red dots are our indications, our sensor-based indications that a kinetic event has occurred in this spot, a kinetic event that has left an atmospheric or other sensor-based signature that are an artillery strike, a missile strike, an explosion of any kind has occurred in the past, again, 24 to 48 hours. Now, this approach has its limitations. You might be wondering, well, what about all of the, non-explosive, non-major kinetic damages that occur in a given conflict? We rely on other research mechanisms, other research avenues to determine those. For example, a tank or other military vehicle runs into a monument, runs into a historic building, clips it, takes out a wall. These are the types of impacts that are not going to be captured in an approach like this, but this provides us with a starting place for not only identifying where impacts are occurring in a larger area, and more importantly, it provides us and our stakeholders with a starting place that narrows the universe of concern one needs to be addressing on a 24 to 48 hour period, a moving target in many ways. And so what you're looking at is, of course, our cultural heritage sites in our inventory in the blue dots, those impact indications, sensor-based indications in the red dots and the surrounding yellow radius around them. And what that allows us to do, again, is create that short list of potential impacts. Now, once we have a potential impact, then we get into the process that you're more familiar with, which is the imagery process in making that confirmation. So while we rely on a lot of analytical functions in order to determine that short list of potential impacts, our confirmation impacts are always a human process. It always requires a human determination of interpreting something like satellite imagery in order to make a confirmed impact determination from, again, that short list of potential impacts. So what you're looking at right now, and we have permission to use this this image from Maxar, fortunately. So this is an image of the Koropeckyj Museum that you guys probably remember being impacted in late February of this year. The Koropeckyj Museum is there, the L-shaped, the upside down L-shaped building in the center of the image now. This is February 14th, 2022. This was an image we had access to in our archive through Maxar. We were able to task an image, and that's what you're looking at on the screen here. So within 24 hours following that event, that was picked up in social media and other open source channels, it was picked up in formal media, and it was also picked up in some remote sensing indications as well on our end. And so what we did was we had that tasked image back to us from February 27th, 2022, immediately following that indication that something had happened. And that's what you're seeing now is basically the shell of the building left. The roof is gone. The interior contents are burned out. And this is an indication to us, of course, that we can make a confirmed impact in this case. So I show this just to demonstrate the process that we use for going from potential impacts to confirmed impacts. Now, important to us in this case and other cases is we recognize that it's no longer sufficient to just say impacted or not. At the end of the day, that helps a few stakeholders, a few missions in order to prioritize when and where something needs to be responded to. But also we need to focus on the context of impact. We can collect some of that information from open sources, formal media, and things like that. But we can also leverage the imagery we have in front of us to make some of those determinations as well. And I should say not make determinations, but make inferences about what might be happening. In this case, you can look at something like the immediately surrounding buildings, all residential in this case, the immediately surrounding landscape, the trees, the vegetation, and identify that very few, if any, of the surrounding environment has been impacted. It is really confined to the building itself. And while an image can never tell us, an image alone can never tell us intent for why cultural heritage is being impacted, we can begin to infer and use this as just one piece of independent evidence, an independent line of evidence to suggest that this might not be collateral. Again, we can't make that determination from the image itself or the image alone, but it does add one piece to that conversation. Now, to date, we've identified several hundred impacts. To date, we have identified several hundred potential impacts throughout Ukraine since roughly February 27th, 28th, when the formal beginning of that invasion occurred. We've gone back and actually have identified several potential impacts that likely occurred earlier than that date as well. And what you're looking at is just a snapshot of that at the countrywide scale, the orange being, again, just those potential impacts. As you can see, just a view, it is not just, Eastern Ukraine that we're worried about. It's not just Kyiv that we're worried about, but really this is an effort that does require a country scale monitoring research program in order to determine when and where impacts are occurring. Because, like I said in the beginning, if we were to focus our efforts geographically within Ukraine, we would miss potential impacts that would otherwise, go unseen. So I want to say continuing forward, I want to leave this at continuing forward for now. So like I said, we have identified several hundred potential impacts of varying degrees of confidence. And we're systematically going through those and using multiple independent lines of evidence to determine confirmed impacts from that short list of potential impacts. We are working with stakeholders of these data, most of whom benefit from our process of narrowing the universe of immediate concern through potential impacts every 48 hours. And so when I mean active monitoring, sort of real-time monitoring in the conflict, I should say near real-time monitoring. the sensors that we have access to, the imagery that we have access to, we were able to keep up in this monitoring effort in a 48-hour cycle right now. So every 48 hours, we run the countrywide analysis to determine potential impacts in that period. We deliver that information to our in-house researchers, but also to a variety of stakeholders, again, who benefit from just narrowing the universe of what has happened or what has potentially happened in the past 48 hours. From this information, we are developing new systems, models, and approaches to drive two things. One is comprehensive cultural heritage monitoring at the country scale, not just in Ukraine, but in general. So while Ukraine is certainly the focus right now, we are using this to not only assist in these efforts in Ukraine, but also determine a methodology that will allow us to do this in the future, perhaps in a way that is closer to real time, perhaps in a way that gets us to 24 hours rather than 48 hours. The types of cultural heritage impact that would otherwise go unseen. So that is a major reason why we are developing this approach, is in order to identify those small scale impacts that might go unseen for reasons of scale, for reasons of imposed significance, for reasons of beginning with a prioritization list rather than beginning with cultural heritage writ large. And again, that might be kind of vulnerable to some of the inherent biases and limitations of the initial research framing. Now, the last thing I'll just kind of leave off with is through those models, systems, and approaches, I will admit our present state is currently ready, reactive, and responsive. We are largely forced into being in a reactive position right now. But with these approaches, with the development of models, predictive models in particular, vulnerability models that might suggest, based on this conflict and others, what cultural heritage types, locations, or proximities might be inherently more vulnerable. We would like to get to a future state of being proactive, predictive, and protective, so that we're not solely responding after the fact, but could potentially get out ahead of impacts to provide some level of resourcing and safeguards ahead of natural disaster and conflict. So with that, thank you so much. Brief acknowledgement to our sponsors here and our partners. And otherwise, I'm handing it back to you, Dr. Daniels.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bassett. I am now going to invite Mr. Koropeckyj to the virtual podium.
Well, first of all, thank you very much to the U.S. Committee of the Blue Shield for inviting me today. Let me set up my presentation here. So Dr. Bassett spoke to our work, monitoring cultural heritage destruction. My presentation today is going to be focusing on actually the creation of new monuments in Ukraine and how that may indicate a pattern of what I term building advantages in the cultural terrain, which is an activity that I think these patterns make clear that Russia was participating in the build up to this new offensive that began in February. So I'm going to go in this presentation, from big picture down to small picture, some qualitative descriptions, and then going back to some examples of these monuments that we're seeing constructed in Eastern Ukraine and Crimea. So in conducting this work, open source research was performed to find examples of new monuments that were constructed in Eastern Ukraine behind the line of contact, as well as in Crimea since 2014. Those monuments were grouped into themes, as well as specific placement that I'll get into later. And that was all finally analyzed in the framework of trying to see if these monuments were portraying narratives that we were seeing in other avenues of information operations, such as traditional and social media. And I'll note here that this research is still ongoing. Monument construction was recorded up to a month before February 24th, before this new offensive began. And some of this analysis is subject to change, especially its framework, such as the monument themes that you see here. So briefly, the results of this research, you can see that 90 monuments were originally reported. That's now up to 100 after this preliminary analysis was conducted, with the majority of these monuments being constructed in areas with high population density. So especially in Eastern Ukraine, in Donetsk and Luhansk, in those capitals in Donbass. And here we just have a theme. We have a summary of the monument themes. I'll note here that, on the left in Crimea, you can see that the highest number of monuments are dedicated to World War II and to monuments concerning the Russian Empire. And I'll give you an explanation about that later. On the right, you can see the highest number of themes by far. Highest number of monuments is themes concerning events that have occurred since 2014 in Eastern Ukraine. You'll see that there's a big discrepancy between that and the monuments in Crimea. And you'll also notice that there's a much higher number of monuments to the Russian Empire in Crimea versus that in Eastern Ukraine. And I'll give you an explanation for that as well. It's also notable that there are no monuments to what the Russians call the polite people, or other folks have referred to as the little green men, in Eastern Ukraine. So how do we explain some of these discrepancies? World War II monuments present the second highest number of monuments in both Crimea and Eastern Ukraine. That's for a number of reasons. First of all, there are a high number of these monuments already existing in Ukraine, and that holds true for the entire former Soviet Union, and that's based on a campaign of monument construction that was constructed by the Soviet Union beginning in the 1960s. So you have existing monuments to build off of. You get historical legitimacy there, but it's also useful for this narrative that you see in other avenues of Russian IO, which is framing the war in Donbass as a continuation of World War II. The other explanation, as I explained, that discrepancy between monuments in the Russian Empire and to the Russian Empire in Crimea versus those in Eastern Ukraine, is that even Western scholars who have approached this topic acknowledge that there are stronger Russian historical claims to Crimea based on the history of the Russian Empire there. And so that may be an explanation for why you see so many of those monuments in Crimea. So a secondary part of the analysis was looking at the actual, what I call the monument context. So these are the specific locations where these monuments were placed. As you can see, what's really notable here, there's a marine monument, which I'll get to later, which is very interesting, but by far there are three primary locations where these monuments are being placed. That's in parks, historic locations, again, which may be near other World War II monuments or the rebuilding of these World War II monuments that have been damaged in the fighting since 2014. And then in institutional locations. So that's in the shadow of government buildings, of, I want to say particularly, Soviet era institutional buildings such as palaces of culture, which is a big thing that you still see there. And why is that so useful, those three primary locations? Well, first of all, parks are anecdotally a high traffic area in Ukraine in particular, and there are also a high number of parks in the former Soviet Union based on public planning, based on emphasis and access to green space. So that's a very wide-reaching area in which to put monuments for any number of reasons. Historic, as I explained before, you see World War II monuments in particular being utilized, A, because they already exist, so you're gaining historical legitimacy from that, but it's also so useful to build off of those narratives concerning World War II, especially in the conflict there. And then finally, institutional monuments, institutional settings were also a big part of the Soviet campaign of monument construction. So placing, for example, Lenin monuments outside of government buildings and palaces of culture, that's something that you're still seeing in this monument construction now. So I'm going to move from, that quantitative overview of the data as it's been collected and show you 3 case studies that kind of give you a qualitative perspective so that you can really see what these monuments look like and what they mean. So first of all, Sabra Mohila. It's a Bronze Age burial mound located on the steppe, on the Ukrainian steppe. So it's a high strategic point which saw fierce fighting in World War II, overlooking again very flat lands. So that became a point of heavy fighting after the conflict began in 2014. You can see this is a screenshot from video footage of the battles in August 2014. That's the 60-foot tall obelisk on the right there, and that's a number of indirect fire impacts where that smoke is present in the foreground. Ultimately, the obelisk was destroyed completely in the fighting, and it was taken by the separatists and has been held in their territory since. So almost immediately after that, separatists who died there were buried on the mound. And during unexploded ordnance clearance, they actually found the remains of Red Army soldiers who died there as well. And they were reinterred with those separatist fighters. So already, almost immediately after they took this point, they made these claims to it. Further, in 2017, a chapel was built on the grounds along with another cemetery. So it's becoming this point of reverence. And then finally, it was announced in 2021, last year, that the entire damaged memorial complex would be cleared so that they could rebuild the monument. So this is when we originally tracked this damage to the monument. So on the image on the left, you see the destroyed obelisk kind of lying on its side. And then by May 2021, you see that much of that has been cleared. You see heavy infrastructure activity in that area. And I'll note that originally, all of this work was claimed by the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic as being their own work, as being kind of a homegrown operation. But in the lead up to the invasion, actually, they've made official points of Russian official support. So Russian organizations are now publicly supporting this project. And this only occurred in announcements right before the new offensive in February. So this is concept imagery for the new monument. You see the obelisk is still there. You have stairs leading up to it. All of that, kind of looks similar, but importantly, you see the years 1941 to 1945, which is the Russian dates for World War II, juxtaposed with 2014 on the left. So that is, directly linking the fighting that occurred in 2014 with the Soviet war in World War II, which is a pretty clear linkage that frames the war in Donbass as a continuation of World War II, which is one of those really important narratives that you're seeing in Russian information operations. Next, I'll move on. This is a monument to the paratroopers that was installed in 2015 on the anniversary of the creation of Soviet airborne troops. So that's still, venerated as an institutional holiday to airborne veterans. And so this monument was for airborne veterans who died in the fighting in 2014. Notably, that monument was actually vandalized. That's not the only act that we've seen of new Russian monuments that have been vandalized. But that's not the end of the story for this monument. It was actually, there was an offer that was put out by the Night Wolves, their chapter in Donbass, to put that monument on display at their own base that they have in Luhansk region. So the Night Wolves are a proxy group that at this point is publicly acknowledged as being funded by the Russian government. They operated in Crimea prior to the annexation and after, and members of the Donbass chapter also participated in the fighting directly and openly in eastern Ukraine. And that picture on the left is the Russian president with the leader of the Night Wolves. So if you visit their base, which is officially listed as a museum in Google Maps, you see a Soviet car collection, which you can visit. You also see old military equipment and other monuments within their base. Again, a lot of Soviet equipment and material. And if all of that messaging has been too subtle for you up to that point, on your way out of their base, you'll see the juxtaposition of these two images, which I think hit the point across of their messaging efforts. That's not the only activity that they have in the heritage space. They've installed multiple monuments in Eastern Ukraine. This is a monument that they installed pretty early, again, in an institutional setting outside the separatist government headquarters. You have the Russian double-headed eagle, and there's a poem below it that discusses broken Russian lands. And I'll let the chapter president describe what that really means. So again, that's a really, really clear example of the kind of narratives that they're trying to portray in these monuments by a known Russian proxy. Finally, this is a monument installed in Kerch in Crimea, installed in 2019 by the Russian Military Historical Society, which was founded by the Russian president by decree. It was installed in a park that overlooks the water, a park that was only revitalized after the Russian annexation of the peninsula. So this has multiple layers of meaning. So you have this massive infrastructure project. The monument actually overlooks the Kerch Bridge, that $4 billion project that connects mainland Russia to Crimea. Again, in this public park that was revitalized, and it specifically invokes an alleged story that's over 1,000 years old. And again, this quote is from a newspaper announcing it, really emphasizing the restoration of solid Russian power in Crimea. That pretty clearly speaks to the monument depicting Crimea as historically Russian, which again is another narrative that we see so much. Again, even in Western appraisals of the situation as it is. And so finally, with that out of the way, with that qualitative look, we can go back to seeing examples of these new monuments so that I can really emphasize, I suppose, the systematic approach that we're seeing to the utilization of these themes and locations. So on the left here is a monument to Stalin that was installed at Levadia Palace, which will come up again in the other examples that you're going to see. But that image is also useful because I'll first note that you're going to see in a lot of these photos children and young men and women in military uniform at ceremonies in front of these monuments. You'll also note in that image on the left, that's Sergei Narishkin, who is now the head of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, and also the head of the Russian Historical Society, speaking at the opening of this monument, along with the head of the Night Wolves in the back there. On the right, you have Felix Dzerzhinsky, who was the founder of the Soviet secret police and predecessor to the KGB. That's a monument that was installed in Eastern Ukraine very recently. I'll note that since the conflict has escalated in February, we've seen calls for the very famous monument to Dzerzhinsky that originally stood in front of the KGB headquarters, now the FSB headquarters. We've seen calls online for that to be reinstalled by Russian actors in Moscow. This is that monument in the Marine setting that I was speaking to earlier. This comes as a part of all of that massive infrastructure work that you're seeing as a means to build legitimacy in Crimea. So a big part of that has been underwater clearance of various obstacles on the coast surrounding Crimea by the Russian government. In this case, you have a ship that sank in World War II that was cleared of unexploded ordnance. And then a monument was placed by these same effectively military divers from the Russian Emergency Ministry. You had this plaque installed. And that infrastructure work leads to, fairly regular announcements of these kinds of finds. So whether it's the recovery of the remains of Soviet soldiers that are in these ships, or archaeological artifacts such as that you saw after the completion of the Kerch Bridge that I mentioned earlier. They're using these regular discoveries to really try and push this narrative of Russian ownership over this territory. Yeah, monuments to the polite people, as they call them, the green men. Again, that's a model that you're seeing in domestically in mainland Russia, as well as in Crimea. But it's not something that has come up in Eastern Ukraine yet, mostly because you see other monuments that I'll point out later dedicated to the fighters in Eastern Ukraine. Monuments to artists. On the right there, you have a monument to Josef Kobzon in Donetsk, and I'll note that that is in the what's called the Alley of Heroes in the major park in Donetsk proper, which has been host to a number of new monuments since 2014. Monuments to the Russian Empire. On the left, that's the only monument that we're tracking so far to the Russian Empire in Eastern Ukraine. But it's notable because that was installed by a Russian NGO, whose leader was actually given an award by the earlier mentioned Russian Historical Society for their work in installing these monuments. And on the right, you have the Russian president speaking in front of a monument to Alexander III that was installed in that same Levadia Palace. So just like the Lenin Komsomol Park in Donetsk, Levadia Palace in Crimea is also kind of a nucleus for this monument installation. So I believe at least 3 monuments have been installed there since 2014. So it's functioning not only as a historical center, but it's also a major park that people have access to. Once again, this is the Russian president in front of a monument to the end of the Russian Civil War. It's installed actually with a view of Chersonesus, which is a site in Crimea that is a World Heritage Site, actually designated by UNESCO, that is now undergoing major destructive Russian construction efforts in an effort to appropriate that site as well. And this is touted publicly by state-funded media outlets as, the only large-scale monument to the end of the Russian Civil War in the former Soviet Union. Finally, we have monuments to Russian media. That's another monument type that you only see in Eastern Ukraine and not in Crimea. And I think that's partly because that's where you've seen journalists killed in the fighting, Russian journalists. That's the head of the Luhansk People's Republic at the opening for this monument. Here's an example of monuments to events since 2014. So on the left, you have that monument in Luhansk that almost exactly matches a monument installed in Palmyra, Syria. And that's actually at an alleged base for the Wagner Group, the Russian private military company. You notice in the center there, they're highlighting the Wagner Cross, which is awarded to those killed in action. So, it's awarded to Russian volunteers, is what they call it, but it's pretty clearly linked at this point to the Wagner Group and indicates their activity in Eastern Ukraine. And I'll highlight another monument to the event since 2014. This is a part of a memorial complex in Lenin Komsomol Park, where you saw that Alley of Heroes monument as well. This is a memorial complex called the Alley of Angels. And it's dedicated to children who've been killed in Donbass since the event started in 2014. I'll note now that since things have occurred, since the new offensive on February 24th, this monument and images of it are figuring prominently in what we believe to be information operations that are trying to legitimize this new Russian offensive as an intervention in what they're deeming to be the genocide of Russian speakers. So you see kind of this reciprocal legitimacy between these social media posts highlighting this monument, and then the monument itself, legitimizing these posts. And I'll note too that there are unconfirmed allegations that troops defaced a Ukrainian monument with graffiti effectively saying "for our children in Donbass," and then Ukrainian citizens allegedly who went to clean that up were then fired upon. So I just want to end on this because it's an indication that we may be seeing real physical consequences for these physical information weapons that are being installed. So I think it's pretty clear that you're seeing this systematic installation of monuments by the Russian government, by Russian proxies, Russian-backed separatists in both Eastern Ukraine and in Crimea. And in particular, these monuments really are, through their location, through their themes, through their specific composition, they are pushing these narratives that we're seeing in other forms of information operations. And I will leave it at that and hand it off to Dr. Daniels.
Thank you so much, Mr. Koropeckyj. I'm now going to invite Ms. Golden to the virtual podium.
Thank you. I'm going to get my screen sharing set up. So just one moment. Could you all confirm that that's working for me, Brian?
Yes, you're good.
Great, thank you. Today, I'm going to build off the presentations we just heard about Ukraine and talk about Russian heritage operations in the occupied territories of Georgia. And I want to start by thanking the United States Committee of the Blue Shield for including me in this session, and to Brian Daniels for moderating the session. I'm going to start by giving a bit of background on Georgia, the current political atmosphere there, and then talk about some case studies of cultural erasure in three categories: intentional damage, neglect, and rehabilitation. And the examples I'm going to be talking today are based on my ethnographic research conducted in Georgia in 2019. I'm presenting Georgia as a case study today on Russian operations and gray zone operations at heritage sites because Georgia has experienced warfare, protracted conflict, internal displacement, and borderization for many years. Georgia can demonstrate what we might see following the conflict in Ukraine, or provide analogous cases to what we've already observed in Ukraine and other post-Soviet countries. I think the Georgian case study also clearly demonstrates the ways that cultural erasure is tied up in other processes of gray zone operations, including borderization and disinformation campaigns. So this is a map of, this is a map of Georgia. It's located in the South Caucasus, bordering Russia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Turkey. But this map is a more representative of the lived experiences of Georgians today. So you can see that there are two separatist regions in Georgia: Abkhazia shown in green and South Ossetia shown in purple up here in the north. And South Ossetia is also referred to as the Tskhinvali region or Samachablo by Georgians, but to keep things simple, I will be referring to it as South Ossetia today. After a long history as an independent civilization, Georgia was annexed by the Russian Empire and later became part of the Soviet Union. And at different points under Soviet rule, Abkhazia and South Ossetia were ruled both as part of the Georgian Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic and had their own political autonomy. And this administrative difference that changed throughout the Soviet rule was one factor in creating two opposing histories, wherein Georgians view both of these regions as historically and culturally part of the historic Georgian empire and culture, whereas separatist Abkhazians and Ossetians claim autochthony and independence. When the Georgian nation state was established in 1991, tensions in these two regions continued to rise, and since the fall of the Soviet Union, Georgia has been enmeshed in several wars over these two territories. Between 1991 and 1994, wars broke out in both South Ossetia and Abkhazia, where the separatist states were backed by Russia. Georgia lost control of both of these regions, and it led to mass ethnic cleansing and internal displacement within Georgia and left Georgia economically ruined. There was no active fighting until August 2008, when the 5-day Russo-Georgian War broke out in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And again, those two districts were backed militarily by Russia, and the war ended in a ceasefire. And although there hasn't been active combat since 2008, the underlying conflict over these territories continues and has an outsized effect on the day-to-day lives of Georgian people. The territories are Russian occupied and largely politically controlled by Russia, and there's closed borderized zones to both of these territories. Russia recognizes the sovereignty of both of these regions as independent nations, but largely around the world, they are recognized as within the borders of Georgia. And as of 2018, a total estimated 232,000 people remained displaced within Georgia, many of whom still live in temporary IDP structures that were built as temporary solutions to this problem directly following the conflicts. So one of the ways this is experienced by Georgian people is in processes of borderization. You can see here on the left is the borderized zone to South Ossetia, and on the right is an Abkhaz border gate. So although the conflict in 2008 lasted only 5 days, it has had a very real impact on how Georgians experience their country and how they are allowed to travel freely within its boundaries. The borderized zone moves farther and farther into Georgia because they are not officially demarcated borders. And while the Abkhaz border is somewhat open and Abkhazians are allowed to pass freely into Georgia and back, Georgians are not allowed into either of these regions without a passport of Abkhazia or South Ossetia. This is also seen as a frequent subject of political demonstration. This is a photograph that I took when I was in Tbilisi in 2019. And shows a demonstration held on the anniversary of the 2008 war at the Georgian Parliament building. And you can see these banners say Abkhazeti and Samachablo are Georgia. And then on the left, it says 20% of Georgia is occupied by Russia. And this is a reference to an incident where a young woman was hurt in a political protest over this conflict and lost the eyesight in one of her eyes. And so she's really become a symbol of this movement and is related to, the loss of one eye from the body is related to the loss of 20% of Georgia's territory. And I think that really demonstrates how personally this is felt by Georgian people. So that takes me to cultural heritage erasure and destruction. And I'm showing here a picture that is clearly not from Georgia. This is the explosion at the ancient city of Palmyra in Syria during the Syrian civil war. And I show this as a counterexample to what I've observed in Georgia. If you know any examples of cultural destruction, this is probably what you've encountered. This example was shown widely in news media, and it's these really dramatic moments of cultural destruction during conflict that grab the public attention. So, perhaps this image or the image of the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan being exploded are those landmark examples that get brought up again and again when we talk about cultural destruction in conflict. But the erasure that I've observed in Georgia is very different from this, to the extent that it's not always even recognizable as damage or erasure unless you have context to understand the cultural site and its history. So I'm going to be talking about it in 3 categories today. Intentional damage, which is the most similar to what we just saw and the most recognizable form, neglect, and rehabilitation. So first, intentional damage. As I said, this is the most recognizable form of erasure and the most similar to what we've witnessed in other, what we've witnessed in other conflicts around the world. But it is also relatively rare and underreported in Georgia compared to many other conflicts where intentional cultural destruction becomes a large issue. Reports of intentional damage are mainly limited to military activity at Russian military bases in the occupied territories, but there's often very little information or documentation of this damage to access. So one example of this is at the Tsirkoli Church of the Mother of God, which is in 8th or 9th century Georgian church. And a Russian military base was built nearby. And then at that base, they carried out military exercises that reportedly caused damage to the site. So this is a quote from the report to the UN Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, where they said that intense military exercises permanently conducted by the occupational Russian troops caused damage to churches and castles. For example, because of the systematic military exercises of the occupying forces illegally stationed in the village of Akancheti and the powerful explosions, extremely important cultural monuments were damaged. The second category I want to talk about is neglect, and this is a passive form of destruction where the occupying governments and the officials of Abkhazia and South Ossetia are not taking actions to preserve and monitor natural damage that is occurring to cultural sites in their territories, either caused by natural disaster or natural erosion or collateral damage from the 2008 and earlier wars. So another example of this is at the Ambara Church in Abkhazia. As a note, I am using Abkhazia for my examples today simply because the access to information and photographs from that region is much easier to access and compile than from South Ossetia. But these are processes that are happening across both territories. So the Ambara Church in Abkhazia is a preserved early medieval Georgian complex, and it has been in ruins for many years, starting in the 1800s, but it is in dire need of structural support and urgent rehabilitation. You can see in these images, there's vegetation growing all over the sites. There's no monitoring being done at the site. Tourists are freely allowed to visit. There are reports of litter and graffiti on the grounds. And the condition is to the extent where the Georgian government has reported on the need for work at the site, and they have requested support and monitoring to no effect. The local government in Abkhazia is not taking any action to protect this site. And so while this is not outright destruction or erasure, it still represents an intentional and strategic decision by the Russian-backed government in Abkhazia to neglect the site and to choose not to put resources towards making sure the site is stable and well cared for. And this is likely because the site is so tied to Georgian identity and history and ties the land to that Georgian identity as well. And finally, I want to talk about rehabilitation. And this is where I'll spend most of my time of this presentation. This category contains sites where they have not neglected the site to ruin or damaged it outright, but Russian, Abkhaz, and Ossetian officials have attempted to rehabilitate religious sites as Abkhaz or Russian Orthodox places of worship. This process damages the historic integrity of the sites and erases the trace of Georgian religious, linguistic, and ethnic history in occupied regions. So my first example of this is the Dranda Cathedral in Abkhazia, Georgia. This is a site that dates back to 551 BC and has had many iterations of temples and churches built on this land over time. And here you can see the site before and after rehabilitation projects. The before is on the left, the after is on the right. And you can see that the exterior walls were plastered and painted, modern windows were inserted, damaging the exterior walls. If you look at the back right of the after photo, you can see these new constructions have popped up, which is evidence that the grounds were disturbed, heavy machinery would have been brought in, and archaeological evidence at the site is likely disturbed and destroyed. There are also reports that the 7th century baptism font on the inside of the church was destroyed, and the interior dome was replastered and repainted as well. So if you visited this site without context of what it used to be, it might not appear like outright damage. It looks clean, it looks structurally sound, it looks like it's being well cared for. The new constructions show a level of investment in the site, and even the way that they have avoided plastering and painting over specific panels on the exterior of the church that had inscriptions on it shows a level of intentionality that could be mistaken for a professionally done, well-advised renovation project. However, with context, we know that this is actually erasing specifically Georgian features of the church and is intentionally obscuring that part of the church's identity and history. Another example of this is at the Ilori Church in Ochamchira, Abkhazia, which is an 11th century church, again, built on the site of an earlier temple, and it's dedicated to Saint George. The Ilori Church has a long, important history as a religious center of Western Georgia. In the 1840s, after the Imeretian Kingdom, which is a Georgian kingdom, was incorporated into the Russian Empire, the exterior walls were painted white, and after that period, throughout the Soviet period, the site was largely neglected. However, it was not repurposed for other public and political uses, as many other churches were across the Soviet Union. And so throughout this period, Ilori was able to function as a center of Georgian Orthodoxy in Western Georgia, and was particularly significant for holding a 16th century icon of Saint George. So this photo is from after that period. You can see it's already been painted white. It's in pretty rough shape, and the site also sustained damage from the Abkhaz War in the 1990s. So this photograph is from somewhere between 2005 and 2009, before the subsequent renovation works. It was in dire need of stabilization. There was a hole in the roof from collateral damage during the Abkhaz War. And the Georgian Orthodox Church sent a request to the Russian Orthodoxy that asked for the involvement of Georgian and international experts in any renovation projects at the site. But instead, renovations were planned by the Russian and Abkhaz Ministries of Culture. And this is a photograph of the church now. You can see these reddish pink accents were added. The walls were again painted and plastered, and the plastering selectively covered exterior inscriptions, which I will show you next. Inside of the church, there were supposedly Georgian paintings that were removed and covered, and this new golden Russian-style dome was constructed. The Abkhaz government has since conceded that the rebuilt dome will need to be replaced, but they also defended these actions as necessary rehabilitations after years of neglect and after the 1992 war, during which the church's roof was damaged. This is a photograph from a Blue Shield Georgia report that shows the selective covering of inscriptions at the site. So you can see at the top, and there's a blown up version of this image, there's this plaque with iconography of St. George that was left uncovered. However, at the bottom left side of the wall, there were Georgian language inscriptions that were plastered and covered over. And that's an act that Georgian scholars have interpreted as a deliberate alteration of the original architectural form of the site and obfuscation of the Georgian features of this church. The fact that the restorers chose architectural and decorative features to cover and others to leave alone shows that they had the skill and foresight to identify the specifically Georgian features of the site and the skill to alter only those that exemplified Georgian history or aesthetics. So the intentionality of these renovation projects is really meant to erase the trace of Georgian history and therefore strengthen the Abkhaz and Ossetian claims to these lands. So I want to close my presentation with a quote from Nicolas Rurua, who then was the Georgian Minister of Culture, in a speech to UNESCO about these issues. He describes the lack of access to and control over heritage sites on par with cultural and linguistic control by Russia in the occupied territories. He says that cultural heritage is being relentlessly destroyed in an attempt to justify forced demographic changes and ethnic cleansing, and that the Georgian government is deprived of the possibility of protecting invaluable cultural heritage sites in the occupied territories. And finally, he says that in most cases, these masterpieces of Georgian architecture are being deliberately destroyed and damaged with the aim of eradicating the signs of Georgian historic and cultural presence in the occupied territories. So you can see how deeply felt this is by the Georgian people and how it's a process that is very tied to the other types of gray zone operations we're seeing in the occupied territories and other formerly Soviet states. So I'm going to stop there and turn it back to Brian Daniels. I'd be happy to answer any questions about my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Golden. I'm going to invite our three speakers to turn their screens on for Q&A, and I'm going to invite our audience attendees to put questions in the Q&A that we will get to between now and 11:30 Eastern. So Dr. Bassett, I want to start with you. And so one of the things that you discussed and the features you discussed of the Kimmel's work is the kind of 48-hour data pool, a data poll that you're doing to try and understand what kinds of sites and what kinds of damage we are seeing in Ukraine. And so I wonder if you might say a little bit more for us about, any trends that you have noticed thus far, understanding that potential impacts are not confirmed impacts, and that this is this is something that we're all working through in the kind of the fog of war moment. But I'm wondering if you might offer some initial thoughts and reactions on the data that you're seeing.
Absolutely. So one thing that I'll start by saying is that we've realized there's some major advantages in doing assessments every 48 hours. And what that gives us is a kind of a new variable to understand how cultural heritage is impacted in conflict. And that's the variable of time during the conflict itself. If we were to go back after the fact, months ahead, years ahead, and look at all of the impacts and say, okay, in aggregate, these are the total impacts to cultural heritage from a conflict, we'd miss maybe how those impacts changed over the course of the conflict, where geographically impacts were occurring at any given moment. And that might give us some indications as to what's going on. Now, in terms of some of the specifics that we're seeing over the past 4 weeks of doing this is, the first thing that I'll say is a lot of our understanding of this conflict is certainly guided by media reporting. Media reporting has its limitations. What we're seeing in the data every 48 hours is that the impacts to cultural heritage are distributed across the country. They're by no means focused on just the city centers. They're by no means focused just on the east or the north, but they're quite evenly distributed across the country. I'll also say that one thing that we're seeing in the data is that there is a large number, and I'd say increasingly growing over the past week and a half, of potential cultural heritage impacts in the western part of Ukraine. And when I say western part of Ukraine, I'm specifically actually talking about the areas surrounding Lviv and south as you get towards the Romanian border. So that's an area that's I feel like might be underreported in the conflict itself, but it's an area we're seeing a lot of impacts to cultural heritage. Now, I mentioned several things that might go unmissed if we were to work from a prioritization list. If I could speak to quantities and representation of site types that we're seeing potential impacts to, we are seeing a large number of potential impacts to small, as Gracie and Damian were both noting, so a large number of impacts to smaller churches and chapels, things that are maybe in a more rural setting, but also kind of community scale monuments, things that might not be of national significance, but would certainly qualify as being of local significance. And so those are the types of impacts that just my personal feeling is that those would go unnoticed. Now, in terms of the regions where we're seeing just a large number of impacts beyond that specific western part is surrounding Kyiv. Interestingly, we are seeing some impacts to cultural heritage inside the administrative boundaries of Kyiv, sort of longer range, things we interpret as longer range strikes into Kyiv, the city center area. But most of the impacts are occurring at the administrative border of Kyiv and not penetrating into that administrative border. One could interpret that in many ways. One could interpret that as this is the current line of engagement. One could interpret that as instructions have been given of where and where not to impact critical infrastructure, cultural heritage. I consider critical infrastructure in this case. And then I guess the last thing I'll say is that that element of time that I mentioned in the beginning. The past 4 days have seen the largest number of potential impacts to cultural heritage in the entire conflict. It is by no means, the conflict is by no means sort of quieting in any way. We are seeing an escalation in the impacts to cultural heritage, but I'll also say an escalation in the impacts to kind of all forms of infrastructure. So those are kind of the working observations that I can provide right now, but certainly more will be forthcoming.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bassett. Mr. Koropeckyj, I'd like to ask you a little bit more about one of the really interesting findings that you gave us about monument distinction between Eastern Ukraine, the separatist republics, and Crimea. And I'm wondering if you might speculate or offer us some of your thoughts about why we see such differences in the kinds and styles of monument construction between both areas.
Sure, I think it's partly the nature of the conflict. Crimea was relatively bloodless in its annexation. There were, I guess, some positive imagery for Russian speakers. For example, the Green Men, the statue of the soldier holding the cat, that's based off of a real photograph from that time in 2014. So they might see that partly as useful in Crimea, whereas in Eastern Ukraine, obviously it's been a devastating conflict all these years. And so a lot of those monuments, I only touched on it briefly, but a lot of the monuments dedicated to events since 2014 in Eastern Ukraine are highlighting alleged Ukrainian crimes against civilians, for example. So you see plaques in residential buildings or nursing home even that was allegedly impacted by artillery at some point. So I think it's partly how the conflict has taken its course in those two locations, the difference. And obviously, again, the true, to some degree, Russian history and activity in Crimea is something that they highlight a lot. And I want to say on top of that, I want to get the chance to say that I think, as Grace pointed out, there's a different nature to the kind of cultural heritage destruction we're seeing. And I think that's partly because it's a different approach in that in a lot of these locations, I think it's safe to say that the Russians are not saying, you don't belong here and we're going to destroy this. What they're really saying is we belong here and this belongs to us. And that leads to what I would call, perhaps destructive appropriation. And I think that's also had an impact possibly since the 24th of February that, that had an operational impact, perhaps that may have impacted their preparation of the environment. There's a lot of media speculation about that. So I don't want to ascribe all of this to cynical Russian pragmatism, taking advantage of these indicators that they see, but I think it is a truly held belief, at least certainly by the Russian president, some of these narratives.
All right, thank you very much. Ms. Golden, I wonder if you might follow up on this theme of destructive appropriation, because in the kinds of breakdown that you've given us for what was happening in Georgia, certainly ahead of the events of this year in Ukraine, we're certainly seeing some crossover in process. And so I wonder if you might offer your thoughts about the extent to which that some of this may have played out in Georgia a little bit more, and how you're reacting to seeing some of this information in Ukraine.
Yeah, of course. First off, the examples I gave are things that we've already seen in Ukraine and many other countries, and I think they'll be continuing to play out. I do think in terms of watching Ukraine and what might occur there, the monitoring that Schimmel is doing is really important and really crucial to seeing what comes next, because these tools weren't available in 2008 when these wars were happening in Georgia. And the level of monitoring and being able to know what sites may have been already damaged will be an indicator for potential destructive appropriation, rehabilitation projects down the line. I also, what's played out in Georgia so far is kind of in the, I don't want to say post-conflict because the conflict is very much still happening, but in the protracted conflict timeframe. So I will be very nervous and wary to watch some of these processes continue and perhaps grow more apparent in Ukraine in the coming years. Another piece that I want to mention is in terms of monitoring these activities and learning which sites are most vulnerable to this kind of approach. I think the most important thing that we can be doing from the United States is talking to our colleagues on the ground who are already doing this really important work in Georgia, in Ukraine, and other countries that are seeing these same processes. They know the sites that are important to them, and they know the sites that are vulnerable to this kind of destructive appropriation, and they can help guide us and tell us what they need better than we can ever do from, where we are in our offices in the US.
Thank you very much. This does recall Dr. Bassett's point that it appears that many of our potential impacts are very much locally grounded and locally important heritage spaces, and perhaps not, sites at a scale of national importance where we would get that kind of attention. And so this engagement with our colleagues who are working on this on the ground right now and who are themselves oftentimes at great risk is going to be especially important. I want to thank the three of our panelists for really a terrific discussion, very timely and important for global events right now. And so with that, we'll conclude, and I'm going to call up Dr. Patty Gerstenblith, who is the president of the U.S. Committee of the Blue Shield. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you to the panelists. That was a really fascinating view of a current conflict and impact on cultural heritage in real time. We're going to be shifting gears to a different area of conflict located in close by to Georgia, which we just heard about, but looking instead at Azerbaijan and Armenia. It is my pleasure to be moderating this panel and to welcome our two speakers. But I want to say a few words and introduce both of them before we go to them. Few disputes in recent years have engendered as much disagreement over the role of cultural heritage in both historical territorial claims and current conflicts as the dispute that we're going to be talking about. While claims of cultural heritage damage, destruction, and erasure have been stated by both sides, it is unfortunate that no fact-finding mission was able to visit the disputed territory of Nagorno-Karabakh before it was returned, after being occupied, before it was returned to Azerbaijan in the fall of 2020. Such a fact-finding mission would have been able to establish a baseline of the status of the cultural heritage in that region before it was returned. And this would have been beneficial, in my opinion, to both Azerbaijan and Armenia. I also want to explain, this is the one session that is being dominated by lawyers, as opposed to the sessions that we've heard so far. I think of this to some extent as the revenge of the lawyers, because we're going to have our chance to use almost as many acronyms. I don't think we could possibly use as many as were used yesterday during the presentations by members of the military. But this session was inspired by the recent decision of the International Court of Justice in December, applying the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, or CERD, in the case of Armenia versus Azerbaijan. And I should mention there was a companion case. Oh, I'm sorry. Is everybody hearing me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. There was a message that popped up here. Okay. So this panel discussion was, as I said, inspired by the ICJ decision in December under the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, or CERD, which we will hear more about. And I will note that there was a companion case of Azerbaijan making very similar claims against Armenia. While Armenia asserted several bases for its claims under the convention, what is of interest to us here today is that the ICJ utilized a non-cultural property specific convention to protect cultural heritage rights. The reason for this, I believe, and we'll hear more about this from the panelists, is that largely due to jurisdictional issues and what I can call shortcomings or oddities in the 1954 Hague Convention, which is the major cultural property convention for protecting cultural property during armed conflict, the ICJ would not have had a basis for either international enforcement or jurisdiction under the Hague Convention. Although I also note that the Hague Convention is considered a part of customary international law, and it's been used in other international tribunals, particularly during the trials of the former Yugoslavia. It is my hope that we will address some of these shortcomings or oddities in the discussion today. I'm going to begin by introducing both of our speakers. The first of which is Gabriel Armas-Cardona, Esquire. He is a human rights lawyer originally from the United States. He has worked in Armenia, India, and is now based in Germany as a Wissenschaftlicher Mitarbeiter, or research associate, at the University of Leipzig. There, he teaches international human rights law and US law and coaches the Philip C. Jessup moot court team, a subject dear to my heart as I have occasionally participated in the same moot court competition. Our second speaker is Alexander Herman. He is the director of the UK-based Institute of Art and Law. And I want to pause for a moment to add a personal word about IAL, the Institute, which was founded by one of the most eminent cultural property lawyers and professors, Professor Norman Palmer. I've heard many people over the years who have claimed to be the first or the only art law lawyer in the United States or in the United Kingdom. But Norman actually was the first and most prominent art law lawyer in the United Kingdom. If you look at any developments in UK law over roughly 25-year period, you will discern his fingerprints, either obviously or indirectly. He was truly a giant in this field. I'm proud to say that he is one of those on whose shoulders I am very proud to stand, and who was taken from us far too soon. He still had much to contribute. Following Norman, Ruth Redmond Cooper ran the Institute for many years, maintaining and expanding on Norman's contributions to the field. Following Ruth's retirement a few years ago, Alex was named the director of the Institute of Art and Law. Alex has written, taught, and presented on an array of topics in relation to art and cultural property, having recently published his book, Restitution, the Return of Cultural Artifacts. His writing appears frequently in the art newspaper. He has been quoted widely on art law topics, including in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Guardian, The Telegraph, and Bloomberg. Prior to joining the Institute, he worked for Norman Palmer in London and practiced in Montreal. He is also program co-director of the Art, Business, and Law, LLM at the Center for Commercial Law Studies, Queen Mary University of London. I will now turn this over to begin with Gabriel and followed by Alex. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just want to check, can you hear me okay?
I think now we can.
Excellent, okay. And I believe I should have the power to share my screen. Is my screen visible?
Yes, it is.
Fantastic. Okay, great. I have subtitles on, which I generally teach to people that English is not their native language. If that is distracting for any of you, I apologize. If it is, please ignore it. Okay, so to begin with, hello everyone. My name is Gabriel Armas-Cardona. I'm a lawyer, as Patty mentioned.
Gabriel, your sound, at least for me, is there's static on it, I think, a little bit. I don't know if you can improve that or not.
Sure, 1 second. Is this any better? I just changed my microphone.
Yes, much better, thank you.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm presenting on the factual background that underlies the ICJ case. And so I'm going to be diving into what the conflict is about, the background of it, the wars, and the impact on cultural heritage. And as Patty mentioned, I did live in Armenia. However, I was requested to give a neutral presentation of the facts. And so that is what I'm intending to do in this presentation here. So let's begin. All right, the outline of what I'll be talking about over the next few minutes is to give a background. So everything before the 1990s. Then in part 2, I'll talk about the 1994, after 1994, so the frozen conflict period, and then the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War. And then part 3 will be the impacts on cultural heritage in the vicinity. Okay, let's begin. So welcome to the Caucasus. There are 3 states of the Caucasus: Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. There's also 3 large external actors: Russia, Turkey, and Iran. And within, there's also 3 breakaway regions. For anyone that was sitting in for the last session, they must have heard about Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which are located here in Georgia. The bulk of our conversation is going to be evolving here in Nagorno-Karabakh, which is in the state of Azerbaijan, but it's ethnically Armenian. Okay. In this presentation, in these slides, I give more information than I'm able to talk about within the set period of time. I mean, I could talk about this for hours. This conflict is unfortunately very rich, very long, very complex. So I put more information on the slides than I plan on covering, and I do that on purpose that you can look back on it if there's anything that you want to check. So all I'm going to say at this point of this slide is to note that the conflict is long and complex. So really, I'm only giving a really shallow perspective on everything. And if you want to go into any details, feel free to ask me more questions in the Q&A. Right. Just to give a timeline, so we all have the basic idea of the key issues here. So starting in 1918 to 1920, there was an Armenian-Azerbaijani war. In 1920, the USSR takes over the territory of modern-day Armenian Azerbaijan. And in 1923, Moscow establishes the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast, the NKAO, in the Azerbaijani SSR. So an oblast is a sub-republic level administrative area. So you've probably heard the term a subnational level, like how a state in the United States or a province in Canada are subnational levels. So the oblast was like that for the USSR. And the NKAO was predominantly Armenian. Fast forward about 65 years or so, and we have starting the fall of the Soviet Union, and we really have a rise of ethnic nationalism. And one of the aspects, or one of the ways that plays out is that the NKAO votes to join Armenia, so the Armenia SSR, and leave the Azerbaijani SSR. In response, there was the Sumgait pogrom, which is a 4-day pogrom that occurred in the city of Sumgait by ethnic Azerbaijanis against ethnic Armenians. And in response to that, there was the Gudgark pogrom, which was a pogrom that occurred by Armenians in Armenian SSR, which expelled Azerbaijanis from the Gudgark district of the Armenian SSR. This was considered the unofficial beginning of the first Nagorno-Karabakh war. It is not at this stage a full-scale war, but there's already a lot of heightened tension and flashpoints. Just to name one of the most notable ones, in January 1990, there was the Baku pogrom, again against ethnic Armenians. This lasted for 7 days. But it isn't until early 1992, after the Soviet Union truly collapses, so Moscow has no more control, that full-scale war begins. And this full-scale war was had many atrocities. It was a brutal war. Just to name an instance of it, there was the Khojali massacre of 200 to 600 Azerbaijanis, primarily civilians, by Armenian forces. And when I say Armenian forces, recognize at this time, everything is very irregular. You know, these states have only been in operation for months. And so there's not as much state identity. It's more an idea of ethnic identity that really exists at this stage. Anyways, in May 1994, just fast forward, because of limited time, the war ends with a ceasefire agreement, but it's really predominantly an Armenian victory. Then after that, we have the frozen conflict period, followed by, in September 2020, we have Azerbaijan attacks initiating the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War. This war lasted 44 days, and it also ends in a ceasefire agreement, but this one is predominantly an Azerbaijani victory. Okay, so that's the fast forward version of the history. Let's get into some of the more details, the frozen conflict period, and then the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War. So the aftermath of the war created this situation. If any of you have ever been involved in this conflict, you probably have seen this map, because this is the map that existed for multiple decades. So we have here the Nagorno-Karabakh Oblast, which generally remained, there's a little bit that was taken control by Baku, but it generally remained under the control of the Armenian forces. The orange area became a buffer area. This is where Armenian forces ethnically cleansed Azerbaijanis from these areas. These areas were always predominantly Azerbaijani, and Armenian forces came in and to create kind of a, I guess militarily it would be more protectable, a shorter front line, a shorter line of contact, which therefore was easier to control. This resulted in over these 6 years, there was a mass flood of people. And so we had moving to Azerbaijan, 684,000 IDPs, these coming primarily from the buffer area, from the orange area here, and then 185,000 refugees coming from Armenia itself. And then to Armenia, there was 72,000 IDPs and 299,000 refugees coming primarily from the larger Azerbaijani cities like Baku, which is over here. The leadership of the NKAO then declared itself a state, the Republic of Artsakh, which you can see in the flag here and in this icon, the the icon of the state there. This frozen conflict period was not so cold. It was a warm frozen conflict. And what I mean by that is that in contrast to other frozen conflicts in the post-Soviet space, this one had regular shootings. It had irregular attacks, like larger scale attacks that I'm just glazing over just to say that ultimately, there's no major changes that occurred during this time, but recognize that it was still hot, even though it was a frozen conflict. The OSCE Minsk group was the primary group in charge of, or is the primary group in charge for establishing a negotiated peace. However, excluding the 2008 Madrid principles, they really did not have much success whatsoever. And that's in part because there is a big intractable stance, differences in stance between Armenia and Azerbaijan. To Armenia, the key thing was to recognize the right of self-determination of the ethnic Armenians. From the late 80s, there was pogroms and attacks against Armenians. And so the idea was that the only way that Armenians could be safe is if they have their right to self-determination recognized. And this could be, the most extreme version of this is that it would be kind of similar to Kosovo, that only through their own statehood could they be safe. In contrast, Azerbaijan emphasized the core principle of territorial integrity, that this is Azerbaijani territory, that Baku should be able to control it because it is its territory, end of story. And just to make a point of contrast, this is not quite similar to the situation of Russia and Donbass in Ukraine. If I go back a slide, so the buffer area here was never claimed by Armenia. Armenia never claimed any territory in this region, in the Karabakh region at all. And the Republic of Artsakh technically never claimed the buffer area as its own, although it left it ambiguous, and I'm sure it did that for strategic reasons to see if it would be possible to try and claim that territory in the future. And then finally, the Republic of Artsakh has never been recognized by any UN member. So its impact has really only been very locally focused, and especially now after the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War, its functioning is quite limited and really done in collaboration with Russia. Okay. So let's get to the second war. So the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War began on 7th of September 2020. Azerbaijan attacked. And Azerbaijan was using more modern weaponry. So using, like, for example, Turkish weaponry, Israeli weaponry that included modern drones. In contrast, Armenia used mostly Russian and Soviet weaponry, such as unguided artillery rockets. And the fighting primarily stayed in the Nagorno-Karabakh region, but missiles were launched outside. So, for example, the city of Ganja in Azerbaijan was struck multiple times by rockets. And Vardanis, a town in Armenia, was also struck as well. This conflict ended in, the open warfare ended in November 10th with a ceasefire agreement that was brokered by Russia and Turkey, in where Russian peacekeepers would come to take over the protection of the ethnic Armenian community. So you can see here's the dotted line that shows the old NKAO, where now everything in blue and now green is controlled directly by Baku. So the Russian peacekeepers are here in the orange region, which is where the ethnic Armenians now live. About 45,000 ethnic Armenians fled during this war, with about 100,000 remaining. Okay. So that's the conflict. Now let's get into impacts on cultural heritage. I'm dividing this into two parts. I'm going to begin by looking at the Armenian approach to protection of Azerbaijani heritage, and then I'll do the other way around next. So what is the Armenian approach? To say it in one sentence, generally cultural sites, the Armenian approach to protection of Azerbaijani heritage. And to say it in one sentence, generally cultural sites were not respected. So after 6 years of war, after the first Nagorno-Karabakh War, there was a lot of damage. And damaged structures were basically just either removed, they were used for construction material or maybe construction space, or they're just left completely derelict. And an example of the latter is the photo to the top. This is the former home and also museum of the poet of Natavan in the city of Shushi. And you can see that it's effectively been abandoned. There's two key exceptions to this, though. In that, first is that mosques, specifically mosques, the religious sites, were preserved, but were also left unprotected. And so this meant that the buildings, all the mosques still were standing, but there's vandalism and there is also acts of desecration by local residents. So if you go on pro-Azerbaijani websites, there'll be photos of cows and pigs that have been brought into mosques done by locals as a form of desecration. The other exception is for militarily strategic sites. So the most notable example here is the town of Agdam, which was militarily strategic because it was very close to the line of contact. And so for military reasons, the decision was made to just completely wipe out the town. Every single building was destroyed, with the lone exception of the mosque in Agdam. It is the only remaining building in what was a town of 28,000 people. So naturally, there was a bunch of, there were museums and cultural sites within that town, all of which were destroyed. This next slide is not talked about that much, and for time reasons, I'm actually going to be skipping it. It is a concern that comes up in two examples. It is the Persianification of Azerbaijani culture, so looking at Azerbaijani culture as belonging actually to Persia, to Iran. But as I said, because it doesn't come up that much, I'm going to be skipping it because of time. Okay. Next is the Azerbaijani approach to the protection of Armenian heritage, and I'm going to generally categorize this into three different categories: Potemkin sites, eradication, and Albaniafication. And let me explain what I mean by those. So this category 1 sites are, what I mean by Potemkin sites are sites that are restored in image by the government, but they're fully in control of the government and they don't serve their original purpose. So an example of this is the Armenian church in Baku, which is now fully owned and controlled by the government and is used as a book depository. You can see it no longer even has, it has, of course, the architecture of the church that it was, but they removed the religious iconography. For example, the crosses were removed. To the right is the Gazan Chesots Cathedral in Shushi. I believe that this will become another similar site to this. The cathedral suffered a double tap strike during the 2020 war, but my personal belief is that it's going to be fully repaired and kept as a iconic site, simply because it's too well known, too recognized. There's nothing else that could be done with it but to maintain it where it is. The next category is complete eradication. And what I mean by this is complete eradication, as in to completely destroy any evidence of its existence. And the most egregious example of this is the Armenian cemetery in Julfa, which was completely destroyed. So the Armenian cemetery was a cemetery in Julfa, was a cemetery with over 1,000 khachkars, or crossstones. And there are photos of it dating from the late 1800s, because it was such a impressive site. And we can see that as late as 1987, we still have these khachkars standing. So we still have functionally, maybe they were left a little derelict, but they were still operating. They're still standing. By 2002, they had all been knocked down. And then in 2005, Azerbaijani soldiers came with sledgehammers and pulverized them and literally took the rocks and rubble from the tombstones and dumped it in the nearby Arax River. And then within the next year, turned the site into an army training ground. And when challenged about this, Azerbaijan's response was, quote, "There are no Armenian graves in the territory of Nakhchivan. This is just an Armenian fabrication." And note that, please recognize that this is not even just like an image of our Azerbaijani soldiers. This is a still that's taken from a video. This region is right, as I mentioned, it's right next to the Arax River, which is the dividing line between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So this was being filmed as it occurred from the territory of Armenia. And just another thing for you to note is that this occurred in Nakhchivan, which is not in the Karabakh region. So this is not actually in the conflict zone. This is in the Azerbaijani exclave, which is to the west of Armenia. So you can draw deductions from that of how this issue with cultural heritage goes far beyond just the limited area of Nagorno-Karabakh, but really affects the conflict entirely, an entire conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Then the third, the Caucasian Albanian theory. So this is a very prominent theory promoted by the Azerbaijani government. So I could not go without saying this. So in Azerbaijani historiography, there was a kingdom called the Caucasian Albania, no relation to modern day Albania, that existed in this territory as you see here. I already got the flag that I am low on time, so let me just skip ahead. The problem with this theory is that one, it's really not recognized by anyone else in the world besides Turkish and Azerbaijani scholars. And then two, even if this is true, which I am not a historiographer, I'm not going to challenge it, it doesn't fit the dates and locations of what we have. So here is a tweet by Anar, by the Azerbaijani Minister of Culture, claiming that the Armenian Dadivank Monastery is a Caucasian Albanian site. And he says that it was built in the 9th to 13th century, which as far as I understand is true. But that means it was built 1 to 4 centuries after the supposed Caucasian Albanian kingdom was gone. And furthermore, it's located 125 kilometers west of the alleged territory of Caucasian Albania. So, Patty, I apologize, but this is my very last slide. So let me just say this and we'll be done. So what is the situation that we're in now after the 2020 war? So Azerbaijan regained a lot of territory under its control. And on that territory are many instances of cultural heritage, among others, Armenian. And unfortunately, there's already signs of destruction of Armenian sites. And so we have here is a satellite image showing a cemetery in a village. And here you can see the tombs that are here located to this bottom left of the image. And then here, 1 year later, you can see that it has all been bulldozed, and you can't see any evidence of it existing anymore. And so this is the factual situation that led Armenia to request a provisional measure from the ICJ on protection of cultural heritage. Okay, so that is the background on the facts. I'm of course happy to talk about that more if you have any questions. Let me just explain one last thing before I hand over to Alex. So we're going to be talking about the ICJ's provisional measures. The ICJ is the International Court of Justice. It's the highest court in the world. It's a court that is able to make cases on any issue of public international law. The issue for the court is that it can only have states as parties. So it only can be against state A versus state B, in this case, Armenia and Azerbaijan against each other. And there has to be consent from the states. So that consent can either come, that the state can willingly say, okay, I will consent to going before the court on this issue, or the consent could, for example, come from a treaty, as what we will be, Alex is going to be talking about further. Furthermore, the court has the ability to issue provisional measures. And a provisional measure from the court is really like a preliminary injunction in US law. So it's a order by the court that is temporary with a purpose of protecting the interests of the parties from irreparable harm. So if harm can occur while the case is ongoing, the point of the provisional measure is to ensure that that does not happen until the case itself is settled. And just to bring a very recent example of this, Ukraine brought a case against Russia to the ICJ using the Genocide Convention as the source of jurisdiction. So in the Genocide Convention, any state that has signed onto it has given that consent to the ICJ to go before it. And so that's why Ukraine was able to bring the case to the ICJ against Russia. And in that case, similar to here, the court issued a provisional measure ordering Russia to, in this case, cease all hostilities. And that was aimed at to ensure the protection of the rights of the relevant parties, in this case, Ukraine. So last thing just to say is that the ICJ is, again, only state to state. In that sense, it is quite different than the International Criminal Court, which is a court for individuals that have committed war crimes or other similar atrocities that have not been tried in their own home countries or cannot be tried, can instead be tried in the International Criminal Court. So that's quite distinct, and it's not what we're going to be talking about here. Okay, I think that's enough of an introduction, so I'm happy to hand off to Alex, and please take it away.
Thank you, Gabriel, and thank you to Patty and the U.S. Committee of the Blue Shield for inviting me to speak. I think I'll jump right in. What I wanted to start with was an overview of the international rules that govern the protection of cultural property and cultural heritage in the context of war and occupation. So we can keep in mind the 2020 war in Nagorno-Karabakh, which Gabriel helpfully outlined while I go through this. He mentioned at the end of his talk that the International Criminal Court is one potential international forum where the perpetrators of the destruction of cultural heritage can be brought to justice. There is a particular war crime that's set out in the ICC statute, which involves the intentional direction of attacks against buildings dedicated to religion, education, art, science, and historic monuments. Unfortunately, neither Armenia nor Azerbaijan are party to the ICC statute. So that means that it is not a forum that could hear any challenges around issues that arose during the conflict. There is, of course, the 1954 Hague Convention on the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict, which many of us know quite well, certainly at the Blue Shield. The 1954 Hague Convention is, as it says, sets out to allow the protection of cultural property during armed conflict and occupation. Both Armenia and Azerbaijan are party to the Hague Convention. Article 4 of the Hague Convention sets out in broad terms the respect for cultural property, and there are various forms in which that respect has to be demonstrated by parties to the convention. Now, whether or not we categorize the conflict in 2020 in Nagorno-Karabakh as an international conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, or a conflict of a non-international nature, to use the language of the Hague Convention, either way, the respect for cultural property needs to be demonstrated. So that Article 4 provision needs to be honored. And that includes refraining from using cultural property in a way that would subject it to damage or destruction, and refrain from any act of hostility against cultural property, subject to a waiver for military necessity, which I think causes a lot of frustration in cultural heritage circles, because there is that potential get out for states parties to the Hague Convention who can allege that there was a military necessity for an attack, for example. So as I said, both states are party to the Hague Convention and to both protocols to the Hague Convention, the one from 1954 and the one from 1999. The problem, and Patty hinted at this in her introduction, is that in the Hague Convention itself, there's no process for compulsory settlement of disputes before the ICJ. So there's a system involving protecting powers in the Hague Convention in the conflict. So that would be Russia and Turkey, who are the protecting powers respectively of Armenia and Azerbaijan. And so the protecting powers would try to effectively seek a resolution through conciliation. That's obviously something that would be quite complicated and would take a lot of time. It doesn't provide for a judicial determination by the ICJ. There's also a provision in the Hague Convention that allows for the assistance of UNESCO as well in the process. So those are possibilities of resolving any dispute around the interpretation or the application of Hague. But they fall short of offering a direct avenue to the International Court of Justice. The other way in which the International Court of Justice could, in theory, have jurisdiction, material jurisdiction over a claim, is if both parties to the dispute have signed what's known as the optional clause to the ICJ's statute. So that's basically an acceptance of the ICJ's jurisdiction in a general way, regardless of what the dispute might be, provided it's a dispute with another state that has also signed that optional clause. So, for instance, the United Kingdom, Japan, Germany have signed the optional clause. The United States has not, and Armenia nor Azerbaijan have signed that optional clause. So they haven't opened themselves up to the general jurisdiction of the ICJ. So that means, in relation to the 2020 conflict, there's so far we've seen no possibility of either state bringing a claim to the International Court of Justice. Now, enter the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which Patty referred to as the CERD, which is how I'll refer to it as well for reasons of brevity. This is a convention from 1965. It has enormous level of popularity around the world. There are over 180 states parties to this convention. There are probably very few states that would deny that the elimination of racial discrimination is a valid goal, and so many states have signed up to it. Why this is interesting for our purpose is that Armenia and Azerbaijan are party to this convention, and this convention provides at its Article 22 a method of resolving any disputes around the interpretation or application of the CERD, of going to the ICJ in order for the ICJ to determine the rights of the parties and to make any necessary orders relating to those rights. So that's what allowed both Armenia and Azerbaijan, who brought claims to the ICJ in September of 2021, to trigger the jurisdiction of the court because of this particular convention. Now, the convention relates to the elimination of racial discrimination, racial hatred, apartheid, things like that. And there are a number of allegations both brought by Armenia and Azerbaijan. The ones that we're going to focus on relate to cultural heritage protection and the prevention of damage or destruction to cultural heritage sites. Now, that particular aspect was only brought in Armenia's claim against Azerbaijan and was only fully dealt with in the provisional measures order in the Armenia case, not in the Azerbaijan case, for reasons that we won't get into here. But if you look at the actual decision of the ICJ from December in the Armenia v. Azerbaijan case, it actually engages with this question of cultural heritage protection under the umbrella of the CERD. Whereas in the claim brought by Azerbaijan, this was not dealt with by the court. So if we look at Armenia's claim against Azerbaijan, it sought a number of things, specifically that Azerbaijan abide by the provisions of the CERD. So cease any alleged ethnic cleansing, racism, other forms of suppression of the Armenian minority. There were certain actions relating to prisoners of war that were taken by Azerbaijan, and Armenia had asked for them to be released or treated according to the CERD. And then importantly for our purposes, Armenia also asked for the protection of the minority, the Armenian minority in Azerbaijan, for their right to access and enjoy their historic, cultural, and religious heritage. So that would include churches, cathedrals like the ones we saw in some of the images in the previous presentation, monuments, landmarks, cemeteries, libraries, etc. So the idea was that the CERD as an umbrella convention could include rights that might trigger that kind of protection and allow the International Court of Justice to order Azerbaijan to ensure that those sites are protected. So this is quite rare that the International Court of Justice will deal with issues relating to cultural heritage protection. There's actually only one major case where the ICJ has done something similar in the past, and that was the case of Cambodia against Thailand from the 1960s involving the Preah Vihear temple, which is a temple right on the border between Cambodia and Thailand, and there was a question as to where the border should fall and basically which country should get this temple and the territory around it. Ultimately, the court sided with Cambodia in the 1960s, but that was a dispute that continued on until about 10 years ago, where provisional measures were sought because it wasn't quite clear exactly where the border should lie. In any event, that was the only time, because there was a temple involved and because the ICJ's decision in the 1960s involved an order for Thailand to return to the temple any religious implements that soldiers from Thailand might have taken out of the site, they had to be returned. So that was, in a sense, the closest the ICJ has come to deal with cultural heritage protection. Which was then revisited when further measures were sought in 2011. So what are the rights, going back to the Armenian-Azerbaijan dispute, what are the rights that are actually protected in the CERD? We know that there are rights to equal protection under the law. So that's found at Article 5 of the CERD. And that will include notably the right to practice one's religion and, interesting for our purposes, the right to equal participation in cultural activities. So that's at Article 5(e)(6). And that was the allegation brought by Armenia against Azerbaijan that the ethnic Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh were seeing that right challenged by the actions of Azerbaijan. Now, because this was a provisional measures order by the court, it didn't go into the merits of the dispute. So the ICJ has not yet heard any of the detailed evidence on either side for either of these claims. Because it's, as Gabriel said, a bit like an interim injunction or provisional injunction in a domestic court, it means that the court only hears whether there's a plausible case, and that's the standard that it assesses these matters at. It doesn't go into all the evidence, it doesn't hear full evidence, it just looks at whether there is a prima facie case made that would allow them to basically step in and try to freeze the situation so it doesn't deteriorate. So that's the purpose of a provisional measures order before the ICJ. So in order to succeed, Armenia would have to show that the rights that it asserts under the CERD, so specifically for our purposes, the right to equal participation in cultural activities, that they are plausible. So not that they're convincing, just that they're plausible. They have to show that there's a link between the rights themselves and the provisional measures that are sought. There has to be a risk of irreparable prejudice to those rights, and there has to be urgency. So the court has to act now before the full trial, before the merits are heard, in order to basically stop the situation from getting any worse. So the court went through those requirements and found that, yes, there were rights, and they were plausible in Armenia's case, including the right to equal participation in cultural activities. The court found that there was indeed a link between those rights and the measures that were sought, which was to get Azerbaijan to cease and prevent any acts of discrimination that would affect that right to participation in cultural activities. There was found to be a risk of irreparable prejudice and urgency in the matter. And in that situation, the court looked back to that Temple of Priya Vahir case, the provisional measures that were ordered in 2011 when Thailand and Cambodia went back to the ICJ to find out where exactly the border would lie between the two countries. And in that situation, the court had said that cultural heritage was at risk of irreparable prejudice if there was an armed conflict and if there were armed soldiers involved. So taking that, the court said here, based on the prima facie evidence, again, evidence that hasn't been fully proved, but evidence that is plausible, the court said that it does look like there would be a risk of irreparable prejudice to the cultural heritage and therefore to the rights under the CERD. The order was then issued on the 7th of December. So on that same date, you had the order issued against Azerbaijan, and then another order very similar issued against Armenia. So the court dealt with that, I suppose, in a diplomatic way by making sure it happened on the same date. Both states were required to abide by the CERD, and so obviously prevent racial hatred and discrimination aimed at minorities within their jurisdiction, and not to aggravate or extend the dispute. So in that situation, the two orders were mirror opposites of one another. However, the Armenia case against Azerbaijan also, as I mentioned, included the dispute around cultural heritage and cultural heritage protection. So the ICJ order in relation to Azerbaijan required Azerbaijan to take all necessary measures to prevent and punish any acts of vandalism and desecration affecting Armenian cultural heritage. And so this included acts relating to churches and other places of worship, landmarks, cemeteries, and artifacts. So that, in a sense, for the purposes of cultural property protection, was quite an important step. As I mentioned, the ICJ has almost never dealt with issues of cultural heritage, mainly because the Hague Convention has those fairly unsatisfactory provisions for dispute resolution. UNESCO 1970 Convention, quite similar. It's very difficult to actually have a case go before the ICJ. The reason that this particular decision from December is interesting is that the right to free participation in cultural activities, or the right to equal participation in the cultural life of the community, as we see it in CERD, is a similar right to the one we find in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948 and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights from the 1960s. They have similar cultural participation rights. And academics certainly like to talk about this right, and we like to think about it and look at it, but it's very rare that we see a court actually providing content to that right, to say that that right also includes the preservation and protection of cultural heritage, so that there's now a link, and I think that's starting to be drawn by this particular decision, between cultural heritage protection on the one hand and human rights like the right to free participation in the cultural life of the community. And that link might continue to become developed in the years ahead. So I think I'll leave it at that and go back to Patty for some comments.
Thank you so much to both Alex and Gabriel. Actually, Alex, I think I'm going to stick with you for a moment. I have a question for you. Really to elaborate on your last point. As you know, both of the special rapporteurs in the field of cultural rights have advocated for approaching cultural heritage through a human rights lens. And this was done in the, maybe not so much in the prosecution of Almaty for the destruction of Timbuktu, but certainly in the reparations report authored, well, in one of the reparations reports, I'll leave it at that. And so is it better for cultural heritage and cultural heritage rights to be protected through these other conventions and how, as opposed to through the, the Hague Convention, basically, with its shortcomings? And how could you elaborate a little bit, not only on the role of CERD, but the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, if you are comfortable answering that.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really good question. And I think that, I mean, ideally, it would be good to have an ICJ decision at some point on the Hague Convention, and specifically Article 4 and the respect for cultural property, because I think there's a lot more content that we're hungry for in terms of understanding that particular obligation on states. The reason it obviously came before the ICJ was through the CERD, so the CERD was kind of the vehicle for this issue of cultural heritage protection to be dealt with. In a sense, these kinds of issues maybe are better done under Hague, just because the Hague has more detail. It's more understood by the state parties exactly what's at stake with signing up to it. I think the CERD, there's an argument that maybe it was going a little bit far in extending that right of cultural participation to, cultural heritage protection. Although, I mean, personally, I think it is a good thing. And I think that link between human rights and heritage protection is an important one. But it certainly opens the court up to criticism, perhaps, to say that it went a little bit too far in that respect. But I think that the human rights element is an important one, and it probably seems rather logical that how can you have a right to participate in the cultural activities of your community if there's a threat to cultural heritage around you, whether it's religious, cultural, or historic, whether it's a church or a library or a gravesite. So I think it does make sense, and I think this could potentially be something that will open up even further, and we might see it in domestic courts where that link again between human rights and cultural heritage protection is emphasized, where we might see it maybe in some other regional or international courts like the European Court of Human Rights. And we might see it as more of a diplomatic angle as well when states are trying to pressure other states to act appropriately in relation to minority groups within their territory. So I think I don't think all of that will necessarily come from this provisional measures order, but maybe this particular order from the ICJ is a step in that direction, showing that courts are becoming more comfortable with that link between human rights and cultural heritage protection.
If I could follow up with one more question for you, and then I'll go to Gabriel to respond to you. So the second protocol, as you know, has more specific requirements for establishing criminal violations and command responsibility and the like for states that have ratified the second protocol. Does that specificity in the second protocol help the situation of enforceability of protecting cultural rights and cultural heritage rights? Or does it leave us pretty much in the same situation where it's up to national law as we have under the main convention itself?
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll probably, there are some international recourses available, but they will be through the protecting powers, I think, and through the possibly through the good offices of UNESCO as well. So I think it's still too early to tell. I mean, even the ICJ, I mean, that process is probably going to take years to reach a final decision on the matter. And so if UNESCO is involved and trying to figure out what's happening on the ground, you mentioned in the introduction, Patty, that the fact-finding mission has effectively been frustrated. So in a practical sense, I think that's going to be quite difficult. But hopefully, if that does work itself out, then maybe there can be more engagement with those provisions of the second protocol that you mentioned.
Okay, thank you. We can always hope. And of course, without getting discussion, we are all wondering what will happen in Ukraine and what, will there be measures taken? Will there be a prosecution somewhere down the line, either nationally or internationally, for all that wonderful documentation that we saw in the panel earlier this morning? So Gabriel, let me turn to you. Did you have a question first or a comment for Alex?
I actually had a question for Alex. So if you don't mind for me to ask. So Alex,
it's fine with me. I don't know if it's fine with Alex.
Alex, you already hinted kind of at one possible dimension of an answer, but I'll just ask you anyways, and maybe you could flesh it out. So I'm curious to know, what are the typical approaches when there's a large factual dispute? Courts love to deal with issues of law, not with messy facts. And if there's anything going on in this conflict, it's messy facts, both sides claiming different things. For example, Azerbaijan claiming that a particular site is actually Caucasian Albanian and not Armenian, and of course Armenians claiming the opposite. And so how have courts dealt with these factual disputes in the past? And might that be kind of any guide that could be relevant to the ICJ? And I know you mentioned one possibility of like UNESCO fact-finding, which has been frustrated, and that would ideally be a good solution. I don't know if you have anything else or any other suggestions that you could add.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. And I think that ultimately, I mean, the ICJ would have to, as you know, would have to determine, based on the evidence, once there's a full trial on the merits, we'll have to determine based on the evidence, which facts are more probable than not. I mean, I think it will become very difficult as a full trial unfolds. If it does unfold, I suppose it is possible that the parties reach some sort of agreement where they withdraw their applications, but it doesn't seem, from what you've said in terms of the tension in the conflict, that will happen anytime soon. But I mean, courts are often called on to deal with messy facts. I mean, maybe not quite as political and as fraught as this particular conflict, but that's, in a sense, that's the job of a court to deal with. And I think it doesn't, I mean, in terms of cultural property cases at a domestic level, This can arise in slightly different contexts. I mean, Patty is the expert on this, but in courts that deal with restitution claims, for example, or Nazi looted art claims, they're often very difficult facts, or we just don't know enough about what happened because records were destroyed, or there are different interpretations of those records. And the courts will ultimately have to decide, which evidence is more convincing and which evidence might be problematic, and then reach a determination on that. But at least in the court process, whether it's the ICJ or the domestic court, there is a transparent system of decision making and ultimate fact finding. So that is maybe the best we can hope for, but it's a long and cumbersome process.
Thank you. That's a tough question to answer. And certainly in domestic courts, for most purposes, the party, when the facts can't be proven, I'm sure you both know this, the party with the burden of proof is going to lose if they can't establish the necessary facts behind their claim. I'm not actually sure whether the ICJ follows a similar type of reasoning, but it would seem that it would probably be at least somewhat similar. So Gabriel, a question for you. Do you think, I mean, you've both said it's probably going to be a long time before the ICJ comes out with a final decision in this dispute. But do you think that the provisional measures will help at all to alleviate some of the tension in the conflict, at least with respect to cultural heritage?
That's a great question, and my answer to that question depends on whether I'm feeling optimistic that day or pessimistic.
I know that feeling well.
My general approach is this is certainly a good thing, not just from a lawyer and legal doctrine sense. Like in terms of the conflict, it is certainly a good thing to have this outside observer, being the ICJ, coming in and pointing out a concern like this, that will help the conflict. And the main way I see it helping the conflict is because there's a lot of animosity in this conflict. And I cut out a whole bunch of parts from my presentation. For example, one of the things that is outside of the scope of this talk is about how the hate speech was a key aspect of the provisional measures used under the CERD Convention. And the issue with cultural heritage is that people feel exposed by it. So in this case, Armenians that have left the territories and their cultural heritage is now under Azerbaijani control, they feel exposed and powerless to protect it. And that can lead to feelings of frustration, of anger, of resentment, things that will help promote emotive language and raise tensions. And ideally, if this provisional measure is followed, then that's going to remove one of the elements that makes this such an emotional and intense conflict. Maybe, if that is able to be removed, then it's something that it'll be easier for people to approach the negotiating table to actually try to negotiate real peace. And so that in that sense, it's good. But the reason why I'm feeling now today more pessimistic is that we're in a situation where we're not even able to secure human security. Like the people living there are still feeling are in danger themselves. And so I can't have high hopes about the protection of cultural heritage, which naturally I think we would all kind of agree, like if would be on in a urgency priority list would be lower than the lives of the people that are currently living there. Unfortunately, I mean, not unfortunately, it's just reality. And so, I don't know, I go back and forth. It's certainly a good thing that it was done. It certainly can help, and hopefully it will be followed in a way that it will then relieve one of the elements of this conflict. But this is a multifaceted conflict, and it certainly is not going to solve, this provisional measure, even the final judgment from the ICJ is not going to solve this conflict.
Okay, thank you to both of you. Alex, did you have any last comment you wanted to add to what Gabriel's just said?
No, I think that was very, very well put, even if it is a little bit pessimistic at the end of this 2-day conference. But I think that the hope is that if we have more legitimacy and strengthen and buttress the international institutions, including the ICJ and UNESCO and the others, the International Committee for the Blue Shield, et cetera, then I think the more likelihood there will be that these conflicts can be at least aired in a forum that is peaceful, and that is transparent and that is fair.
Thank you. And we're exactly at time. So I want to thank both Alex and Gabriel and all of the other speakers we've had today and yesterday, particularly again to Corey Wegner and Brian Daniels, who organized the conference, to Karen Hutchinson, to James Reap and the University of Georgia for facilitating the technological aspects. And I want to conclude with actually something that Corey and Peter said yesterday. As we look at current ongoing conflicts in many different parts of the world, we always have to view human life as paramount, but we also have to understand the role that cultural heritage plays as both a source of conflict and also as something that helps human beings to survive. And this is, again, the space where the U.S. Committee, the Blue Shield, and the Blue Shield International Movement tries to live. It's in a space we try to expand. We try to give more meaning and more content to those aspects. So please, as I said yesterday, join us in our activities. And the website, as I said, will be coming soon. And so we look forward to hearing from many of you. And again, my thank you to everybody.
Great. Thank you, Patty.
Thank you. And thank you, Gabriel and Alex, in particular. You both did great service, especially I'll say Gabriel, for putting that whole presentation together. So it was, I think we did well.
Second, just 1 second, we're still live.
Okay, all right.